Very good, everyone. That's 5 o'clock, so let's get started, if that's okay with everyone. So we are recording the webinar. Good evening. My name is Stephen Williams. I am the marketing manager for Indiana University Press. It is my pleasure to be with you this evening to bring you this special virtual event on behalf of the press. And we are going to be celebrating two of the launches of two of our very special bicentennial titles this evening. Before we get started, I'm going to do a quick bit of housekeeping. We are going to have some Q&A towards the end of the event. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there will be a Q&A button. If you have any questions for any of the guys, please type them in there and we will answer them if time allows at the end. So enough of that from me. I'm not the interesting one here. So without further ado, I am delighted to turn things over to Jeremy Gray, who is the Senior Associate Athletic Director for Strategic Communications with IU Athletics, and he is going to be our moderator for this evening. Thank you, Jeremy.
Well, it's great to be here with all of you this evening and to highlight two labors of love by two dear friends and excellent historians and journalists who have written compelling books about two subject matters that are near and dear to my heart. And it's great to see David and Ken here, who have been talking separately with me in side conversations and in text messages and in probing emails over the last few years about the subject matter of the book. And it's just so great to see them get it across the finish line. And I'm excited to introduce these two gentlemen to you, and I'll do it in the order in which they will present today. First, David Woods, longtime journalist with the Indianapolis Star, has covered Indiana University football, Butler basketball, amongst other things. But I would say the thing that maybe most distinguishes David, and it's a real gift to the state of Indiana and the athletes and programs therein that compete in Olympic sports. David is one of the great Olympic journalists in the United States. He's covered several Summer Olympic Games, and he has written a book called Indiana University Olympians. IU has a proud and distinguished Olympic history, and he has done a detailed chronicling of the great things that have been accomplished by Indiana University athletes and coaches. His book features profiles of 49 athletes who attended IU. Included are the stories of figures like Milt Campbell, who is arguably the greatest athlete in Indiana University history. He's the first African-American to win the decathlon gold. He went on to play pro football. He was almost an Olympian in judo. He just an incredible figure. Mark Spitz, who's well known to all that have followed the Olympic movement, one of the great Olympians of all time, winner of 7 swimming gold medals in 1 Olympic Games. But the book also highlights fascinating anecdotes and accomplishments of less well-known colleagues, including many that have had humble beginnings in a chicken house, another who earned a Silver Star for heroism in the Vietnam War, and telling the story of the great Lilly King, who is one of our most recent Olympic stars and one of the great Olympic athletes who has become a household name to Indiana fans worldwide. Also, please introduce Ken Baikoff, who covered professional football, was the editor of Inside Indiana, a great journalist who covered all IU sports, and served with me as the post-game host of the IU football call-in show. Ken has a deep love, feel, and understanding for history. And in Inside Indiana, 4 or 5 years ago, Ken started writing stories about the history of our facilities, to the point that in this building boom at IU, where we have either redone, upgraded, added to, or built wholly new facilities on the IU Athletics campus, when we had a question of what we wanted to put on a cornerstone of a building, we would call Ken Baikoff because he knew more about our own facilities than we who were working in the athletic department did. And he has written us a book called Hoosier Beginnings, and it tells the story of Indiana University athletics from its founding in 1867 to the interwar period. It's crammed full of rare images and little known anecdotes. It recounts how sport at IU developed from its very first baseball team, mostly made up of local Bloomington townsfolks, to the rich and powerful tradition that is the Hoosier legacy of 25 national championships and the many Olympic champions that are detailed in David's book. So really excited to talk to David and Ken. Hopefully I introduced their books with a degree of justice for the labor that went into them. And without further ado, we'll let David give a detailed description of the stories that lie within his book.
Well, thanks a lot, Jeremy, for that generous introduction. People who are on it probably know what the book looks like. I'm going to put it up there just so you can see it. It's Lilly King. Lilly King is on the cover, and some other Olympians are on the back. And probably Indiana University sports are best known, and our state is best known for basketball. But somewhat inexplicably, Indiana has been, one of the incubators of Olympic athletes and medalists in this country. And this from the program, I think almost without exception, all the other programs that are producing so many Olympic athletes and medalists have enormous college football income. And Indiana has never had that. And yet the Olympic sports have always been important to the university. It's part of the university's culture. It's part of our state's culture, and it's really a very rich history. For instance, in gold medals, most gold medals won for the United States. Indiana athletes have won 55, which is 8th among all U.S. universities. Total medals won for the United States is 95, which is 11th among all universities. Has had Olympians represent 24 foreign countries or territories. So it really has been a broad stroke of influence in the Olympic world at IU. Of course, Lilly King is there on the cover, which makes perfect sense. And we take her so much for granted, perhaps because she has been so phenomenal since then. She's set world records and won world championships. But you might remember when Lilly King entered the 2000 Rio Olympics, I don't think that many people outside the Indiana swim community had much heard of her, even though she'd had a great college season. But of course, she got into a tremendous rivalry with Yulia Efimova, her Russian rival. Ended up being sort of a Cold War showdown between the United States and the Soviet Union. So Lilly's story, of course, is in there, and a few others who are really well known, as Jeremy suggested. Of course, Mark Spitz is perhaps the greatest Olympian in IU history. You'd have to think so, with him having won 7 gold medals at the Munich Olympics in 1972. His recruiting process to the Hoosiers is fascinating. I'm just going to tease to that. If you want to know what really happened with how he ended up at Bloomington, I'm proposing that you buy or borrow the book and read about it. But famed IU swim coach Doc Councilman really did kind of rebuild Mark Spitz when he got to Indiana after a very dispiriting 68 Olympics. So, the Mark Spitz story is certainly in there. Milt Campbell, who is in the track and field and swimming halls of fame. I believe he's the only athlete to have done that. Jeremy mentioned, of course, he's the first African-American gold medalist in decathlon at the Olympics, but really is sort of oddly, I don't know if underappreciated is the right word. I mean, it's not that he's not known, but even a few years ago when the 100 years of the decathlon was celebrated at the U.S. Olympic trials in Oregon, they had all the former living gold medalists there, and I think all of them were interviewed except Milt Campbell. He's a New Jersey native, set a world record in the high hurdles, standout in judo and other sports. Really is a remarkable person. I think the Olympic documentarian Bud Greenspan once characterized Campbell as the greatest athlete of all time, and then he doesn't end up even on some top 50 lists of athletes of the century. So that's a huge omission. And really, as I researched this book, there are several other stories that resemble that in a way, and that their greatness was perhaps not completely appreciated at the time. Perhaps the most unusual, I mean, it sounds made up. I wrote about Dr. Bell earlier. Dr. Greg Bell recently retired at age 89 after 50 years as the director of dentistry at Logansport State Psychiatric Hospital. But he, as was said earlier, he was raised part of his life in a chicken house, because on his parents' property on the outskirts of Terre Haute, their house burned down. There's no insurance, and that's what was left on their property. You know, they later relocated. He discovered track and field. Didn't even know what that was. Was introduced to the long jump after his favorite event, the pole vault. He couldn't do. He loved the pole vault because his favorite movie character was Tarzan. Pole vault looked like the closest thing to hanging from a vine and hanging from a jungle vine and jumping. So his coach asked him if he'd ever tried this, and he ran down the runway and leaped off the board, and it was longer than the school record. He didn't even know what it was. But he thinks his high school career or track and field career ends with finishing second in the state meet as a senior. Later joins the military, has a few weeks to get ready for the World Military Championships. He wins medals in that, and then fast forward a few more years, he was ill at home. Doctor visits the home, notices these trophies in his home of his parents, and asked him what they were. And he said, well, I won these track medals in the military. And instead of showing sympathy for his ill patient, the doctor exhorted Greg Bell, who then was either 23 or 24, said, well, you have to go to college. You have to go to college and participate in track and field there. And Greg Bell looked at him like the doctor was out of his mind. And he enrolls at IU at the relatively advanced age. During his freshman year, freshmen aren't eligible, but he wins a national indoor championship. Fast forward again to the 1956 Olympics in Melbourne, Australia, and he wins the gold medal, actually handily. The distance wasn't very far because the runway was very grainy, and it just wasn't very good conditions. But Greg Bell twice came within about an inch of Jesse Owens' world record in the long jump, and at the time he retired from track and field, Greg Bell had more 26-foot jumps than any man in history. He really is probably one of the more amazing stories in all of sports, certainly in this state's history, and certainly in IU history. Another story that sort of seems like somebody made it up is that of diver Leslie Bush, who ahead of we'll say 7 months before the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, no one had really ever heard of her. And she got in touch with former IU diving coach Hobie Billingsley, coached her for a while. She surprisingly finished fourth on the 3-meter springboard in the Olympic trials. 3 made the Olympic team, so she had come much closer to making the team than anyone had any idea to expect. And then sort of inexplicably on the 10-meter platform, she finished third to make the team, and she'd never done it before. She had literally not dived off the platform before. And those of you who know diving, it's a scary proposition. It's basically you're asking these divers to jump off a 3-story building. It's almost 33 feet high. Well, then she goes to the Olympics, and again, almost even more miraculously, and Coach Billingsley said it was the biggest upset in the history of diving, and I see no reason to contradict that. She won the gold medal by a little bit more than a point, led from the first round all the way to the end, and was so unexpected that when a journalist called her parents in Princeton, New Jersey, it was the middle of the night because it was Tokyo time. It was not, the schedule wasn't made for American television because it wasn't widely televised. The first Olympics that was widely televised was '68 Mexico City. Anyway, wakes up Leslie Bush's parents. They say, well, this is very rude of you. And they hung up the phone for this crank call that they received that their daughter had just won the Olympic gold medal in diving, which was absolutely, clearly preposterous. That could never happen, except it did happen. And then when Leslie called her parents an hour later, they realized that that journalist was for real and it was not a made-up story. So that's Leslie Bush, and she was only 16 at the time. She later enrolled at IU and became a Big Ten champion diver and went back to the Olympics, but did not have the success she did in 1964. So certainly those, the Greg Bell and the Leslie Bush stories, of course, are just, to me, are just remarkable. Another one that Jeremy alluded to was Greg Troy, who won 2 gold medals in swimming and later won a Silver Star in the Vietnam War. And one of my favorite stories, because my favorite sport probably is track and field, and thinking a lot about these athletes this year who lost the Olympics. We hope that have it next year. But in Roy Cochran in 1939 looked like he was putting himself into position to make the Olympic team in the 400-meter hurdles and maybe in the 4x400 relay. Well, 1940, World War II cancels the Olympics. Olympics canceled again, 1944. 1946, he resumes his track and field career and is sort of astounded that he is running about as fast as he did years earlier. So he went to when the Olympics resumed in 1948 in London. He set an Olympic record in winning the gold medal in the 400-meter hurdles, and then also won a gold medal in the 4x400 relay, duplicating the gold medal won by his brother, who had run for Coach Billy Hayes when Coach Hayes was at Mississippi before taking the Indiana job. So for any of those, I guess, would-be Olympians who thought that their chance for Olympic glory was gone, heed the example of Roy Cochran. His Olympic glory was delayed, but not denied. A couple other, I think, of post-athletic stories that are interesting. A couple of Hoosier distance runners, Don Lash and Fred Wilt, went on to become FBI agents after their career. And another one that I think has an interesting post-career story is Fred Schmidt, who after a medal-winning swimming career, he became a Navy SEAL, and he was led the crew that fished the astronauts out of the Atlantic Ocean after the Apollo 14 and 15 missions. Before I guess turn it to let Ken have his turn, all 4 U.S. gold medal winning basketball medalists are also chronicled in the book. That's Steve Alford, Scott May, Quinn Buckner, Walt Bellamy. Walt Bellamy, after I got reading this, I realized that Walt Bellamy probably has a case of being the greatest basketball player ever to come out of IU. I mean, it's an arguable point, but his record is amazing, and he maybe had the misfortune of being in the NBA at the same time as Wilt Chamberlain and Bill Russell. But he was on the 1960 gold medal winning team at the Rome Olympics, which also featured Oscar Robertson. And if there was a dream team before the 1992 dream team, that was the 1960 team, and the Hoosiers' Walt Bellamy was a part of that. Ken, you want to take a turn now and give us some of your favorite stories from the Hoosier Beginnings?
Absolutely. It's I'm so thrilled that IU Press put this together for us and allows us to is allowing me to do this. I wanted to kind of take you through a little bit. I have a little bit of a presentation here that, hopefully everybody could see with Jeremy, can you see the presentation? Okay. I wanted to show you just kind of, first off, the edge of the rabbit hole, if you will. And I still remember where the edge of the rabbit hole was, and it was in a Barnes & Noble in Bloomington. This picture in particular is in a book called the Indiana University, Bloomington and Indiana University. It's Images of America. This picture, I noticed it in the Barnes & Noble, and the caption said, "The Ferris House and Farm occupied the site until 1956 when these photographs were taken and the site was purchased by Indiana University." This is a photo of the Ferris family farm where the 17th Street football stadium, the current Memorial Stadium, was built. And I called the late great Ed Magoni, who is the publisher of Inside Indiana magazine, where I was editor-in-chief, and said I wanted to do a story about all the former athletic facilities. I told Ed it was going to be a long story, but I thought it'd be pretty interesting. It wasn't one long story. It snowballed to more than 13 features. And over the course of a year, more than 150,000 words, 60 pages of our magazine. And it led us into some pretty deep research, not just on the games, but on the people and the time and how athletics were built. And it also provided me some background on questions that I always had about Indiana University. For instance, why is it Indiana University and not the University of Indiana? You think about, it's the University of Illinois, the University of Kentucky, University of Wisconsin, the University of Kansas. That isn't the case. It is Indiana University. People get it wrong all the time, but the University of Indiana is in Pennsylvania. Indiana University is in Bloomington. And that's in the book about, just to a certain extent, it's about convenience. It morphed from the State Cemetery of Indiana to Indiana College to Indiana University. And the last name change really basically came with no curriculum changes. And it was just about, it sounded better as a university. And so those facility stories and things like this help me establish a little bit of credibility, I guess, when it comes to history. And it led to some people in the athletic department, for instance, asking me why the teams are nicknamed the Hoosiers. I mean, think about it. The nickname could be literally anything, and just about anything was suggested. But they were actually known as the Crimson until the early 1920s. And it took a football game on the current site of the Indianapolis Zoo to establish the Hoosier nickname on a national scale. And that's a story that I talk about in the book. I also spent some time talking about the first athletic team at IU, which was the 1867 baseball team, which may or may not have been founded by this man, who is Malcolm McDonald. He was not a student at IU for very long, but between him and a friend of his named Aquila Jones, they were two of the first people to bring the game of baseball to IU in any real sense of the word, to where they were the first ones to put together a team in a very young sport, just post Civil War. We have the story about how these guys are there and how they also enjoyed a 50th reunion at a football game in 1917. That a picture of them as the last four remaining players is in the book as well. I also tell the story about this date, which is July 12th, 1883, which is a pretty pivotal date in IU history, one of that rivals Founders Day in importance as far as I'm concerned. And on that day, it was a storm blew through Bloomington, and it's one that included an unfortunate lightning strike that hit the ground in the spot where 6 years earlier, Professor Theophilus Wiley had a telephone line, the first in the state of Indiana, installed, and it ran from the science building, which is on the right-hand side, to his home at the Wiley House. Unfortunately, and this is, by the way, a photo that was put out by IU Archives, so I can't take credit for this fantastic Photoshop job, but it started a fire. It set the lab on fire. And the campus burned, which put the future of Indiana University in Bloomington in real jeopardy. Some people suggested that the university get moved to Indianapolis or further south in the state. But ultimately, they decided that the fire was a sign from God himself, literally God himself. And they said, in this calamity, we reverently recognize the hand of God. and were regarded as a summons to advance the university forward. And it led to the university moving from its original Seminary Square location to its current site. That also meant the expansion of everything from the campus to the facilities to the student body and athletics. And that just sent me further down a rabbit hole towards a pile of stories that are fun and interesting and tragic, including that of this gentleman, James Horn, who was the IU football coach, the first IU basketball coach. He was an IU baseball coach, a track and field coach. He was a proto director of athletics. He had an amazing mustache, obviously. And he also accidentally killed an IU team member while demonstrating a 12-pound hammer throw. And there's the story of him and his impact on athletics and how he helped kind of nurture a growing athletics program at a time when people were starting to enjoy just more recreation. I learned the story, and it's in the book, about Duke Trimble, who's an active student and an athlete who overcame a lot of hardship to face a bright future. He was from South Dakota. He came to Evansville, enrolled in the spring of 1903, dropped out in 1905, returned in 1907, obviously had lived a not the softest life. He's 24 years old in this picture, but ultimately he was cut down in his prime by football shoes. And I tell the story about how he got new shoes. These aren't these actual shoes, but he got a blister during one of the first practices in 1909, but he never imagined that it would lead him here because he passed away about a week later. And I tell the story about Duke Trimble and the 1910 football team the next year that went an entire season without giving up a touchdown. I also tell about the story of the IU athletics in 1912 and 1913 and how this 1913 baseball team won back-to-back games, the second coming on the road and at Wisconsin, and how things in Bloomington managed to get a bit out of hand when a riot broke out that rolled through the entire campus and up onto Kirkwood Avenue and into multiple theaters and ended with fires. It's because the baseball team won back-to-back games. So when they say that kids are worse now than they ever been, that is absolutely not true. Kids are the same as they've always been. And when you're bored on a Thursday in 1913, you end up with a riot. I tell the story of William Lowe Bryan on the right and Charlotte Lowe Bryan and how they took axes and helped cut down an apple orchard to help advance Indiana University athletics, along with a pile of students. And this man, Jim Thorpe, an Olympian who I don't think would qualify as an Indiana Olympian, David, but certainly one of the most incredible Olympians, who was an assistant football coach in 1915. And I tell the story about how he ended up in Bloomington. It would be as if Bo Jackson ended up being a football coach at IU, some 30 years ago, while he also was playing baseball, playing football, and was one of the best Olympic athletes in the world. I told a story too about this man who's a stern-looking man. This is Ewald Jumbo Steam, who was basically the Nick Saban of his day. He came from Nebraska to coach Indiana football over a matter of a couple of $100. And he helped build the football program and also coach the basketball team during basically the World War I era. And only to lose his life. I don't know this for sure, but Indiana University has to be one of the only schools in the country that has lost tragically 2 football coaches to cancer while they were on the job after losing Terry Hefner some decade ago. I mean, these are all amazing stories of tragedy and triumph and overcoming the growing pains of establishing athletics as a real entity on a major college campus in a time of just incredible upheaval. They're wild. And I wanted to real quickly present one of my favorite stories as an example of the history, and that has to do with the Old Stolen Bucket in 1930. It has to do with, the bucket people is said to have been used during the Civil War, and another story traces the origins of the bucket to Illinois. it was just used as a trophy. And this is at the first Old Oaken Bucket game, which ended in a tie, which made it so that the I and the P at the top is always at the top of that Old Oaken Bucket. However, 5 years later in 1930, IU still had not won the bucket outright, but everybody felt that they were, IU had a chance to beat Purdue and was going to get the job done. There hadn't been a great season, but when the bucket is involved, everybody was very optimistic. So they held a huge pep rally, and there was a bonfire and the old burial of old John Purdue that they used to do in front of the men's gymnasium. And they got on this very subtly decorated train to go to West Lafayette. 500 IU fans, students, and alumni climbed on that train, and whistles blew as they went through every town. Now, this is the 1930s Scrappin' Hoosiers. The nickname's only about maybe 7 years old at this point. And they had been outscored on the season 115-21, and they scored 14 points in the first game of the year. Well, against Purdue that day, they fell behind in the first 3 minutes of the game when it gave up a touchdown, but Purdue missed the extra point, and it was still 6-0 early in the fourth quarter when IU scored on a 35-yard TD catch and run by Vic Dower, giving IU its first touchdown in 6 weeks. IU made the extra point and gave IU a 7-6 lead. Now, the defense held up, and Purdue didn't threaten, and Indiana won the Old Oaken Bucket for the first time ever. But there was a problem. See, Purdue didn't expect to lose, so they didn't bother to bring the bucket to the game. Instead, it was at the site of where there was going to be a dance that night. They already had the P printed to go on the bucket. Now, some freshmen on the IU football team didn't like that very much, and they headed across the field to try to go after Purdue's victory bell. That didn't go well, and a giant fight broke out between the fans and Purdue players and IU players, and there was just a lot of confusion. Well, that makes it a problem because, again, it's 1930, and you need to take a train, that very fancy train, back to Bloomington, and it's on a schedule. So the letter and the Old Oaken Bucket were over at the Purdue Union waiting that night's mixer dance. The train had to leave, and so IU left one guy behind to get the trophy, and that was this poor guy, Charlie Hoover, who was there as a representative of the IU Student Union. He went to the dance. He was presented the bucket by Purdue's Lloyd Vallely, and the crowd apparently was just stony silent. And Charlie Hoover didn't feel real comfortable taking the bucket and walking out into the night with it. So he decided to pass on walking out with it. And he told Vallely that the bucket could be sent to Bloomington the following Monday, and arrangements were made. Purdue's Lloyd Vallely agreed to send it by express train to the Indianapolis, where it could be picked up by Hoover or some other representative, and Charlie Hoover agreed. But the problem is it's late November in Indiana. So the weather is cold and rainy, and it's not like there were interstates back then. Hoover didn't really want to drive to Indianapolis in the conditions. So he contacted a friend of his, John Bookwalter, who owned the Bookwalter Ball Great House Printing Company in Indianapolis, to see if he would go to the train station and pick it up at the train station and bring it down to Bloomington. Now, Bookwalter wasn't going to Bloomington, but he agreed to pick up the trophy at the train station and put it on a bus to Bloomington that would be scheduled to arrive at 9 p.m. on that Monday, just in time for the dance. Now, the bus arrived on time, but there was no bucket on that bus. So it didn't get to the dance. The next morning, Charlie Hoover calls Bookwalter and says, "Hey, what happened to the bucket?" And Bookwalter was confused because he said he gave the bucket to some IU students who were going to put it on the bus. The problem was those weren't IU students. This story here from the IDS says that a delegation of Indiana students with IU stickers and pennants adorning their suitcases, coats, and laundry bags met him at the station and told him that they'd been sent from Bloomington to get the bucket. So Mr. Bookwalter, having been convinced by the victory flush faces and shining cream and crimson stickers that this was certainly a group from IU, and he gave them the bucket. He thought that he gave it to them, but they weren't. They just took the trophy and bolted. So now Bookwalter decides he's going to call James Fessler, who is this stern-looking man. He is the president of the IU Board of Trustees. It was on the Board of Trustees for 34 years. He felt it was time, because this trophy was missing, it was time to call the governor of the state of Indiana, who is Harry Leslie. He is the Purdue alum. He is a victim of the 1903 Purdue train crash that killed 17 players, including 14 Boilermakers. And for a long time, they thought that Harry Leslie died in that accident. He was taken to the morgue on the night of that accident. Morticians were getting ready to embalm him when they discovered that he still had a pulse. And they rushed him to the hospital. He slowly recovered, but he needed a cane the rest of his life. And this is a picture of that horrific crash that is also detailed a bit in the book, because that crash cost Indiana some serious revenue from a football game that nearly ended the athletic program, basically in the crib. But Harry Leslie got together Zora Clevenger, IU athletic director, and Nelson Kellogg from Purdue to get this all sorted out. And you want to know who's really panicking at this point? Charlie Hoover, because this guy just regrets not being able to get the bucket and go. After they talked about it a little while, some key information came out of that meeting. And it turns out that in the early morning hours of Sunday, somebody had stolen Purdue's victory bell, which is shown here. So Purdue students, wanting to get their bell back, chartered 5 freight train cars to go to Bloomington and get it back, but the bell was found in a ditch near Wingate, Indiana, about 25 miles south of West Lafayette. The cart was being towed by a car, but it crashed and it all landed in a ditch. The bell was beat up, but Purdue had it back. The problem was the clapper of the bell was missing. The mystery stretched on for a while, and it became national news. Now, not this guy, but this is how I imagine that he looked. In the early morning hours of December 4th, an elderly gentleman quietly walked to the loading platform of the Lafayette Journal newspaper and put a crate on the dock, and then he walked away. Employees saw him, but they didn't try to stop him. They went in and locked, they opened up the crate, and there was the bucket, completely undamaged. The links were perfect. It was fine, and it was national news that the old oaken bucket had been discovered. And Zora Clevenger had a meeting to go to in Chicago, and he personally picked up the bucket 16 days after IU won it. Now, the bucket would be put in a glass box, and it was put on display, and it was guarded after that. It has been stolen multiple times since then. And we just go in the book, just kind of what happened that day. You know, was it that Purdue fans, mad about the clapper being stolen, decided that they were going to steal the bucket? Then it becomes a national story, and the governor's involved, and it becomes something different than just a prank. And personally, I think that somebody's father just decided this has to end right now, put it in a crate, delivered it, and walked away. By the way, the bucket the current bucket is supposedly the same one, but I suppose unless you were there every year, nobody could tell for sure. You know, you never know when some hooligan may have just grabbed the bucket and stolen it and run away sometime and did that. That bucket's heavier than you think, all those links. So that's just an example of one of the stories, one of the chapters in Hoosier Beginnings. It was a joy to write, and I couldn't be more excited for people to read the stories that you won't find anywhere. It's packed with original research from the IU archives, and I don't concentrate too much on dates and game results. History is a story, and I wrote the book as if I was just talking to a reader across a table at Nick's or in the stand somewhere during a basketball game, and I really hope that everyone enjoys reading about the history of IU athletics as much as I enjoyed learning about it myself, and that everybody gets an opportunity to just learn the amazing story of the birth of Indiana University athletics.
Thank you both for telling great stories and anecdotes from your books. And Ken's not lying. The old oaken bucket weighs about 60 pounds. Yeah. It's there's a reason it's always a lineman who goes and grabs it after the game. David, if I could, you mentioned that it's almost inexplicable why Indiana would have such a rich Olympic history. When you think of the other schools that do, it becomes pretty obvious why. I mean, UCLA is in Los Angeles, where the weather is ideal for summer Olympic sports. It's in a state with a huge population. same with USC, same with Texas, same with Stanford. With Indiana, not so much. What do you think the reason is? Maybe luck, happenstance, fortuitous hiring of specific coaches in certain sports that produced a lot of Olympians? Where do you think it comes from?
I think maybe some of it's happenstance, but I think probably more of it is because Indiana was fortunate to have such great hires over the years. I mean, at one time, and I remember writing about this when Coach Jerry Yeagley retired. He was kind of the last of these giants, the soccer coach. But at one time, Indiana had simultaneously on the coaching staff, arguably the greatest coach ever in college basketball, Bob Knight, arguably the greatest coach ever in college soccer, Jerry Yeagley, the greatest swimming coach of all time, Doc Councilman, and one of the great track and field coaches of all time, Sam Bell. At one time, they were all on the staff simultaneously. If you can look at maybe one thing, I think that's probably it. I mean, Jerry Yeagley essentially created, soccer at Indiana University, and many of the Olympians and especially the medalists were from the swimming and diving program with Doc Councilman, and Hobie Billingsley was the diving coach. He's arguably as good a diving coach as has ever been. So I think that is probably the main reason. But also the university athletic department gave those coaches the what they needed to succeed, and nothing succeeds like success.
There's also been a diversity of great Olympic performances in IU athletics history, both in sport and in era. If I recall, I remember at least parroting this statistic as a strategic communicator within the athletic department, but every Olympics since like 1932, there was an IU athlete or former athlete who had medaled. So it's not as if IU went through expansive dry periods where they didn't have any Olympic success at all. You can't look to, well, the 1950s were a wash for IU. They've really had a consistent presence over time.
I think there has been. I think there has been a Hoosier track and field Olympian every Olympics since 1932, for instance. Now there was a long drought in swimming, and it's probably really notable that IU went from 1976 to 2016 without a single U.S. Olympic swimmer. And then in 2016, you had Lilly King with 2 gold medals, Cody Miller with a bronze in the 100-meter breaststroke and a gold in the medley relay. And you had Blake Peroni, who swam in prelims, won the gold in the 4x100 freestyle relay. So they went went 40 years without a U.S. Olympic medalist in swimming. There was a couple of non-U.S. medalists in that interim, but Ray Lewis and the rest of the IU swimming and diving program have really had a revival. And of course, a couple of years ago, nearly won the NCAA championship in one of the closest 3-way races ever, and then was third the year after that. But I think it's probably of note that if there had not been that tradition or sort of that foundation laid, even though it was decades before, I don't know if anyone would have had the idea that Indiana could be this good in swimming if the Councilman era had never happened.
Well, and I think a lot of people believe it was due to effective middle management. Just kidding. I'm the administrator for the swimming diving program. Ken, this is a question from someone who's on the webinar here, Sarah, who has asked, what are some stories that didn't make the cut?
That's a good question. A lot of them did make the cut because there were just so many that I could have worked with. One that I regret now not going after is just how the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic impacted the athletic department. When I was writing this book, pandemics weren't on my radar, in the way that they are now. But that is certainly one of the stories that I would put there. But there are so many stories that I guess that are referenced in the book that I would like to have been able to expand deeper in just how different things came about. Jordan Field, for instance, I talk about Jordan Field, which is the current parking lot outside of the Indiana Memorial Union. It was an incredible place in that so much went on there, including, track and field started there, baseball started there. You had the Cincinnati Reds and the Indianapolis Indians minor league baseball team held spring training there during World War II, during travel restrictions. There were a lot of stories just about how athletics developed there, and how students became more and more involved in rooting for their teams and being a part of athletics on Jordan Field. And again, I reference them, but I don't go in depth with some of the stories as deeply as I might have. I also decided to concentrate on the varsity sports at IU, and so therefore I didn't spend a lot of time talking about women in sports, even though women played basketball as an organized group before the men did. It wasn't to where they played other schools, but women put together a basketball team and actually played a little bit before the men managed to get it together and do it. In fact, the first IU men's basketball team, they never really started to practice. They started to get together, but then a smallpox outbreak happened, and so it canceled. That's just a couple of the stories. I could have talked about the golf course that existed where Memorial Stadium, now the original Memorial Stadium, now stands, and how a plane crashed there, in the 19-teens, and things that went into there. There were just so many that I had to pick and choose, just for length. But there are a lot of stories that are just amazing.
We don't have a ton of time left, but if you have any questions, be sure to type them in the Q&A, and I'll read them off. Ken, you were talking about the story of the stolen bucket, and it made me think that most traditions that actually take root have to be organic. The tie in the first game to put the I and P on the top of it, it getting stolen, a fight breaking out. That made the rivalry the rivalry. You couldn't have engineered that in some sort of marketing lab. Even much later on, Martha the Mopley, who would have thought that our icon of basketball would come from a Farm Bureau insurance commercial that played before tip-off, but that's how it happened. It's kind of true that they just blind luck, weird stories, an incident has to create a tradition. You can't create it in a conference room.
No, you really can't. And, part of it is, one of that early Purdue rivalry. Indiana didn't play Purdue for a few years in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, because of the fact that during a game, a Purdue player was running for a touchdown, and an IU player was accused of tripping him from the sideline, and the official didn't see it. And there was Purdue was up in arms and refused to play Indiana because they said Indiana wasn't honorable, and that kind of built that rivalry. It is just really interesting how organically these things do come about. Like just something as simple as the colors of cream and crimson at IU grew organically because of the fans, not the fans, the student body had put together some colors. The cream and black was one of them. Each class had their own colors, And then Cream and Crimson, they decided to get together, and they needed to be something, not just Crimson, because that was what Harvard College is. And so they needed something different. And so they just built on that. And then over time, they are, those traditions come about. And, like I said, with the nickname, they were the Crimson until the 1920s, when the football team had a lot of native Indiana people on it. So the media started calling them the Scrappin' Hoosiers. And then it just kind of built. You dump Scrappin' because, as David Well knows, you need shorter headlines. Can't have Scrappin' Hoosiers. That's too long. So Hoosiers it is. And so, yeah, a lot of those traditions build. And in fact, the traditions that we know now, the candy stripes for basketball and all that, David, I mean, you know that comes from the swim team. Those candy stripes started over there. So all these things are certainly tied in.
No doubt. And David, let's talk basketball for a second. If you were to take the pre-1992 U.S. men's basketball team, it was one of the great sports debates prior to 1992, which was, what is the greatest U.S. Olympic basketball team ever? And it comes down to two choices. And Indiana played a crucial role on both teams. The 1960 team with Walt Bellamy, where he played with Oscar Robertson, Jerry West, and others. And the 1984 team, where Steve Alford played with Michael Jordan, and a team coached by Bob Knight. It also had Patrick Ewing, other great players. Those are kind of the two great amateur Olympic basketball teams. And I think when we talk about 84, as IU people, we often talk about Bob Knight and the practices were here and the games were here. Steve Alford was not just an add-on on that team. He was a vital cog in the wheel of that U.S. Olympic basketball team that was listed as one of the greatest ever.
Yeah, I think definitely the 1960 team was the best, best before the pros. But I think Alford was either like the second or third leading scorer. I got a lot of information for the even though I did interview Steve, I got a lot of information from the autobiography he wrote. But he was a very key person, and he had two advantages in that he knew Knight's system and he could really shoot, and they really needed that. I can't remember if it was a quarterfinal or semifinal game. I mean, he was just spectacular, and I guess in a rare deferential and complimentary tone, I guess, Knight came up to Alford after that game and said, "What, if it not for you, we would have lost the game." And I just very much out of Bob Knight's character, and then I guess it became kind of a family joke with Steve Alford. He would always tease his sons, who were basketball players too. France is still not over me yet. France just can never get over me because he was so good. And of course, he roomed during the trials with Charles Barkley. And Barkley was kind of controversially left off the team. So all Charles Barkley stories were hilarious in Steve's autobiography. But that was the last U.S. amateur gold medal winning team. So that's a very historic team. It had Michael Jordan on it, and when you think about the '76 team with Quinn Buckner and Scott May, yeah, they were 32-0. I think if you include the exhibition games and the Olympics, I mean, those guys were 40-0. They were 40-0, and for perpetuity, because of the way the Olympics have changed and college basketball has changed. This is 2020. In 21-20, what the season that Buckner and Scott May had as collegians and Olympians, will not be surpassed. It just won't. I mean, that'll be the record 100 years from now.
Take the 2 years combined, they'd be 71-1. As an IU fan, bitter that Scott May broke his arm and Kentucky got lucky and won that game by 1 point in the NCAA tournament. But I digress. Stephen Williams gave us a great run of show here, and want to make sure we tell people how to buy your book. But I'd love some closing thoughts from you on people you'd like to thank for their help and why they should buy your book. So I'll start with you, Ken.
Well, first off, I wanted to, I got to thank my wife who's heard me tell these stories about IU, and she's not even a sports fan. She's been married to a sports writer for a couple of decades now, but she's had to hear all the stories, and she nods politely, and she helped edit the book. She helped put it together. She's also a writer, so I appreciate her. I appreciate IU Press, and also the folks at the IU Archives, Brad Cook and Dina Kellums, who were just fantastic in helping along the way. I really appreciate everything that they've done. Ed Magoni certainly was key in helping this. Yeah, the late Ed Magoni, and also a guy that I worked with, Jim Shea, who got the ball rolling in getting me a Rotary Club speaking engagement that led to all of this happening. I really appreciate that as well. I love history, and history is a lot of fun. A lot of people might not think so, might think it's dry, but to me, it's how they've been taught the history. It's not about dates. It's not about events. That is trivia. History is a story, and I wrote this and I put this together because I hope people will enjoy the stories and realize that nothing new ever happens. The world is not that much different now than it was in 1918 or 1900. Technology is different. The way we interact with each other is a little bit different, but the people aren't that different in terms of what their hopes and dreams are, and the triumphs and tragedies. And I hope was that I was able to just put together some stories that will entertain, that will teach, that will give people the chance to go ahead and just say, hey, did you know this? Make them feel good when they're talking to their fans, and also highlight some of the lives of people that lived, some of them more than 100 years ago. Just bring them back to life and give them an opportunity to get credit for the role they played in building IU athletics.
There you go, David. Your turn.
Like Ken, I am also fortunate to live with an astute editor. I run a lot of these things by my wife Jan, and it is to echo what Ken said. Really, it is about storytelling. And a number of years ago, I even I think at a time, I don't know if floundering in a professional career or whatever, but I came even across my own personal mission statement, and that is to inspire and educate through storytelling. And now I kind of feel like I have more of a well-defined purpose with that. And boy, there is nothing more inspirational really than the Olympic Games. I'm an unabashed lover of the Olympic Games. Now I don't love a lot of the things around them. I mean, the International Olympic Committee, some of the national governing world governing bodies aren't particularly admirable, but the men and women who strive and fight and train for these really just glimmer of a moment. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a tragedy those times that the Olympics were canceled, because by the vast majority of Olympians get to do it in one Olympics. I mean, your window of time is so small. I mean, I don't know how many times I've gone through this and I've written about, well, if it weren't for this and that happened. I mean, there were, I think 3 or 4 of these Olympians whose story I chronicled could have been 4-time Olympians, but they were like in Olympics once or twice and maybe got 1 medal or no medals. So it is very much, as much as they train and strive, it is still a little bit of a chance. But over the years, the TV network has done a wonderful job of storytelling. I think that's frankly why the Olympics became such popular TV viewing, is that the men and women have such terrific stories behind them, and I hope I did them justice. I'm very grateful to IU Press for even reaching out and asking me to do this book. They've given me a lot of autonomy, been very accommodating. I was originally asked to write about 20 or 25 Olympians, so naturally I wrote about 49. And when I finished the book, all I could think about is, well, I probably wish I'd written about a few more, but I had to draw the line somewhere. And really all 49 men and women whose stories I tried to tell in this book, I hope I did them justice, because they're certainly inspiring to me, and I hope they are to readers.
Super. Well, thank you, everyone. Sorry, we've got about 30 seconds left, and I have a couple of final housekeeping moments. On behalf of the press, I'd like to thank Ken, David, and Jeremy. You did a wonderful job today. I'd like to thank everyone who worked on their projects, including Peggy Stolick, Michelle Mastro, Gary Dunham, Dean Waters, obviously, thank you very much. Everyone over at the Bicentennial Campaign, Kelly Kish and Sarah Jacoby. Anyone I'm forgetting, you got thanked too, please. And please remember that the books are available wherever books are sold, including the IU website, which is iupress.org. Again, gentlemen, thank you. It was a pleasure. I have plenty of questions that I now am going to want to ask, but I have to do that offline. So thank you very much, everybody. That has been our presentation for this evening, and that's goodbye.
Thank you.